So tonight's lecture, starting off our series, is with Miss Paula Power, who's a biologist here for Channel Islands National Park. She's actually a restoration ecologist and is the project lead on the wetland restoration project she'll be speaking about tonight. And it is a restoration of a rare coastal wetlands at Prisoners Harbor, once the largest coastal wetland on the Channel Islands, and it's an important habitat for wildlife, native plants, and migratory waterfowl. So with that, if you'd help me welcome Paula, we'll go ahead and have her start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, April, and thank you all for coming tonight. Looks like winter has finally arrived, hasn't it, here in the middle of March. So this project takes place on Santa Cruz Island, the largest island of all the islands in the park. Only 19 miles from the mainland, but worlds apart from Los Angeles and all that Southern California has to offer. Rugged, remote, and diverse. The landscape and geography on Santa Cruz Island supports a wide variety of rare and endemic and federally listed species, including the island scrub jay and the Santa Cruz Island fox. And and many rare and listed native plants. So the work on Santa Cruz Island is in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, and it's part of a long-term strategy for restoration on the island that includes bald eagle reintroduction, fox recovery, golden eagle relocation, and pig and sheep eradication. The island also was home to the Native American Chumash for about 9,000 years. And remnants of their culture remain in archaeological sites that are federally protected. So this project takes place at Prisoners Harbor, which is located on the north side of the island. It's the harbor and the lower Cañada del Puerto, and it's the mouth of the largest watershed on the island, drains 13 square miles, including the Central Valley. So this is technically a back barrier coastal wetland, which is a very rare type of wetland in California, and it's rare because 90% of the wetlands in California have been filled. So a back barrier wetland forms when a freshwater creek flows down and meets the ocean at a gravel bar. And the gravel bar, let's see, the creek forms a lagoon behind the gravel bar. And in addition to this sort of arrangement, there's riparian vegetation, and also next to the lagoon is a groundwater-fed wetland. So it's kind of a complex of different ecosystems. This type of habitat is also important in this location because it's on the Pacific Flyway. So the Pacific Flyway and Prisoners Wetland provides habitat, provides a resting place and a food source for migratory waterfowl that are flying up and down the Pacific Flyway. So the Prisoners Harbor wetland was filled about 100 years ago to make way for ranching operation. And when it was filled, it disrupted the ecosystem and the hydrologic function of this site. Adjacent to the wetland is Cañada del Puerto, and during the ranching era, eucalyptus trees were planted, and gradually over time, the eucalyptus invaded the canyonland and filled up the bottomland. In addition to filling the wetland and introducing eucalyptus trees, the creek was channelized with a stone wall, and that altered the hydrology of the site and inadvertently caused massive erosion to a 5,000-year-old archaeological site. Then in the 1950s, corrals were built on the filled wetland, And just a remnant of the original wetland and the freshwater lagoon were still present. So for this project, the goals of the project were to restore the hydrologic function of the wetland and also the riparian corridor. Because these are, the hydrology is all connected. Second goal is to restore the wetland and riparian, let's see, what have we got? Wetland and riparian function, the ecological function, to protect the archaeological site and to enhance the visitor experience. In order to do this work, we had to do environmental compliance. We had to prepare an environmental impact statement in which we looked at all the alternatives for achieving our goals, restoring the ecosystem function, the hydrologic function, and we came up with we determined the environmentally preferred alternative, and to achieve that alternative, we would remove 10,000 cubic yards of fill from the filled wetland, remove the berm that channelized the creek, and that would reconnect the creek with the floodplain. And by doing those actions, the outcome would be to restore the function of the wetland, to restore that historic hydrology, to protect the significant archaeological resources, to restore the habitat for the rare and listed species, and to enhance the visitor experience. Another part of the project, or the second half, is to restore that corridor, the riparian corridor. And those actions would be to remove 1,800 eucalyptus trees, protect 341 existing oak trees, and the outcome will be to restore the ecosystem function of a mile of riparian corridor, restore the historic hydrology, restore the habitat for the listed species and the rare and endemics, and again, to enhance the visitor experience. Well, to do a project like this, the restoration design had to be informed by data, and we had to undertake a series of studies, modeling, characterization, surveys. So our first step was a hydraulic analysis. We have the historic and significant archaeological site right here that had been had that serious erosion that took place, and the hydraulic analysis analyzed the effect of removing the berm and how that would affect the hydrology past the archaeological site. So the hydraulic analysis involved running cross-sections across the creek and modeling what would happen in a 100-year flood. So this is a cross-section through the wetland, or the filled wetland at the time. This is the height of the berm. This is the creek and the eastern bank. So it's compressed. The data are compressed there. But this shows the elevation of the creek in a 100-year flood, and the colors indicate the velocity. So this analysis showed that in a 100-year flood, the water would be flowing adjacent to the archaeological site at about 3 feet per second, which is an erosive force. But with the berm removed, so here we have the berm removed, the water in a 100-year flood would overtop the natural creek bank and flow into the wetland floodplain. And when it does that, it slows the velocity, and the velocity by the archaeological site would be flowing at about 1 foot per second, which is not an erosive velocity. So the hydraulic analysis. Then, just to give you a little primer on wetlands. So wetland hydrology, a wetland is an area that has saturated soils to 12 inches, within 12 inches of the ground surface for 14 consecutive days out of the year. And what that does, when you have a hydraulic system like that, it creates anaerobic soils, soils that are low in oxygen. And of course, plant roots require oxygen. So it's very specific plants that are adapted for wetland conditions. And in a wetland, wetland plants tend to separate out or sort themselves out based on the elevation above the groundwater. So for planning our wetland restoration, we needed to have a very basic understanding, a thorough understanding of the groundwater in relation to the ground elevation. So our work was, our analysis and our planning was based on data that we collected from a series of groundwater wells. We dug and installed wells in 18 locations in our wetland area, including 3 wells that are in red here that were our reference wells. So you have a reference site that's an existing wetland, and then the area where we had planned to do the excavation and restore the wetland. We sampled the elevation of the groundwater. We've been doing that since 2005, so we do that on a regular basis. And it gave us an idea or the information we needed to assess the amount that the groundwater fluctuates with the seasons. How high does it rise in the winter and how low does it drop in the summer? Because those wetlands are so sensitive to the groundwater table. With the information that we collected from the well readings, we could develop a model for our plant communities. So and this is the ground elevation, and this is the water table. And this is from one of our wells, or it's from the wells in 2006, which we felt was an average year based on rainfall going back to the early 1900s. So if the groundwater is more than 1.5 feet above the ground surface, you have open water. That's not good habitat for tules or for other aquatic plants. Anywhere from 1.5 feet to this point right here where the ground meets the water table, you tend to have tules, very soggy soil. You have a willow wetland, and then it gradually transitions into upland habitat. Once we had our model, we could start developing our plant communities with our planting plan. We wanted to have an open water community, a deep marsh with the tules, with standing water, a wet willow, a wet marsh, a wet willow, and a salt grass community. From that information, we developed our design plan, our grading plan, and our planting plan. So this is the area that was to be excavated and restored. And from that, we developed our planting plan and the grading plan. So we would have 2 open water ponds, areas where tules would grow, and then this pale green is a wet meadow. The olive green is a wet willow community, and then the yellow is saltgrass. There was still another step to this process, and that was the historic resources in the area. So the corrals built in 1950 and this little building here called the scale house were considered historic resources. So in order to restore the wetland, we had to remove the corrals and the historic building. Well, when the park had to consult with the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure that how we proceeded was appropriate and the right thing to do. This is a historic shot of the prisoners' area, and this is the historic warehouse, and you can see next to it was a scale house. So the scale house was originally located next to the warehouse, and the SHPO, or the State Historic Preservation Office, recommended that we move the scale house from that location in the wetland to its original location here. And also next to the warehouse were sheep corrals that were in use for about 80 years. And they were removed when the cattle corrals were built. So the State Historic Preservation Office suggested or recommended that we build an interpretive corral in this location to better interpret the ranching era. So then our work was set. We had collected the data, we'd done the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, we consulted with the State Historic Preservation Office, and we were ready to begin the restoration process. And that involved removing the corrals, moving the scale house over here, removing these eucalyptus trees to make way for our fill disposal area, because the fill would be removed from this location and transported and placed on that side of the creek. When we removed the eucalyptus trees, we did what's called a flush cut for a low visual impact. So we cut the trees and we cut them very close to the ground, about 6 inches, and then we put an herbicide on the cambium, the growing layer, because they tend to root sprout or stump sprout. And that prevented stump sprouting, and then we just put leaves and debris on top of the stump and it virtually disappears. That way we don't disturb the soil any more than necessary. The corrals we dismantled by hand, every board, every nail, and a cultural resource specialist inspected or graded all the lumber, and the good lumber is going to be used to build the interpretive corral. Moving the scale house was a group effort, and we placed the scale house on PVC pipe, and we rolled it, and the tractor pulled it. So more on that later. So here we are. We had done the site preparation. We'd prepared the site, removed the corrals, we moved the scale house, there it is over there, remove the eucalyptus trees, and we have this all ready to go to receive the fill. Well, working on the island, as you all know, is logistically challenging, and so to say the least. And all the equipment, all the supplies, all that heavy equipment has to come out on the landing craft, and getting the landing craft back and forth, of course, is dictated by the weather and the tides. So everything, the moon and stars align, and you get your equipment out. The park contracted with a company from Northern California called Eric Ammon to do the excavation. So the experts from the Park Service had our grading plan that showed all the elevations for the pond, the tules, all those different habitats. They staked the area, and the excavator started digging, but we had what we called a grade checker on site the entire time that checked the grade, the existing grade versus our grading plan, to make sure that all those elevations were accurate to within a centimeter, because of the tolerances of the aquatic plants. So they're very specific where they'll grow, and we had to get it just right. But sometimes it didn't go just right. And it rained, and wetlands get really wet really fast. But these guys knew exactly how to maneuver, and they got this equipment out of the mud really quickly. Another thing that was a big surprise that happened during this process was the historic wall that was built during the ranching era to channelize the creek. There are photographs of it. We didn't know if it even existed. We had seen the photographs. We didn't know if it had been bulldozed. It was a pile of rubble. It eroded. But lo and behold, as we were digging and taking the berm down to the natural creek bank, we found the historic wall that was built sometime in the 1880s. So again, we had to step back, and we had to consult with the State Historic Preservation Office, and they recommended that we just cover it back up. It's there, it's protected, we know it's there, and we had to modify our grading plan slightly, but that's what you do when you're out in the field. You have to make those decisions when you're out there. Also, as part of our project and as part of what was required under our environmental impact statement was archaeological and Native American monitors. So all ground disturbing activities had monitors there watching to ensure that if we found cultural resources, that we could evaluate it and go from there. So we did find cultural resources in a number of places. In this location, we had to call in our archaeologist, who then did an assessment and described what we had found, and we had to change our plans again to protect this midden site that we found. Once the grading was done and the soil was at the proper grade, it's pretty disturbed. So we covered the entire site with erosion control cloth, and the erosion control cloth is made of aspen shavings so that we're not bringing any plastic or any kind of material that wasn't suitable for a wetland habitat. And so the aspen shaving erosion control cloth will break down in about 1 to 2 years. Whoops. So our planting plan was for the wetland area, and that left the fill disposal site to be restored at some level. So what we decided to do was to broadcast native seeds on the fill disposal site before we put down the erosion control cloth. And so over the course of about a year, we collected native plant seeds. We got 65 pounds of native plant seeds from about 20 different species and about 10 pounds of acorns. We divided them up according to whether they were upland or sort of midland riparian habitat, bagged them up and broadcast them on our fill disposal site. And the dig is done, the erosion control cloth is in place. Here's our fill disposal site. This is where the berm was removed to reconnect the creek to the floodplain. Our wetland with the 2 ponds. And the next step was to plant 15,000 wetland plants. So we had contracted out with a local native plant grower to grow out the plants. We collected the seed from the island so we'd have the genetic integrity, and it took about almost a year to get that going. We grew them out on an on-island nursery, brought them down to Prisoners to get ready to plant. And then for one straight week, we had about a dozen people out planting according to the planting plan. So again, the plants are so temperamental, we couldn't just put them anywhere. We had 8 different species, and some of them were adapted for the pond margins. Some of them were adapted for the upland areas. And every morning we had a briefing, and we talked about where we would plant the plants and what those species would be. And to get us ready to go, we did after our morning briefing, we would stretch and get completely psyched for our planting. And I have to point out the NPS staff, we had volunteers, and the Los Angeles Conservation Corps did all the planting. It was pretty relaxed most of the time, so relaxed that the little coot that had come to live in the pond just was not bothered by us at all. And I have to say a word about the LA Conservation Corps. This is a nonprofit organization that provides opportunities for at-risk youth, and they helped us the entire time. They did the site prep, they helped us with the tree removal, they helped us with the scale house movement and the taking down the corrals. Just a great bunch of people. We also planted 1,300 willow stakes. And the willow stakes need to be, the end of the stake has to be where there's water, at the water table. at least 2.5 feet down. So if you can imagine trying to dig 1,000 holes 2.5 feet deep. We didn't like the idea either. So we used, this is very temperamental. We used what's called a stinger. So these two plates were attached to an excavator, and there was a mark at the 4-foot level, and that pushed into the ground, and then the plates popped open, and there was a person standing right there who dropped the willow stake between the two plates, and then the plates lifted up and the willow was planted. And it was perfect. And so the plants did really well. I mean, within a few weeks they started growing, and some of them were blooming. So we started with a filled wetland, and this is a photo from about the 1900s. This is the warehouse. It still is there. There was a little scale house there, and this was the old adobe that was destroyed in the 60s. There is our stone wall and the filled wetland. Over time, the corrals were built, the eucalyptus trees grew up. We did our restoration, and within 15 minutes, I mean literally 15 minutes of daylighting the groundwater, exposing these ponds, we had wildlife coming. We had dragonflies flying around. We had killdeer that were flying around. And then it's like, let the party begin. The dragonflies came, the coot was a regular visitor. We had migratory waterfowl coming in. Canada goose rested there for about 3 days. And then it was off. Peregrine falcon is a regular visitor. Osprey comes on a regular basis. And then the plants, the willows have done very well. And there are literally dozens of oak seedlings from the acorns that were planted. So that was just a small selection of the organisms that have come to the site. We've had killdeer, the dragonflies, kingfisher, the foxes, of course. An eared grebe came and visited on its migratory pathway. Pintail, again, migratory pathway, coming in, resting. Solitary sandpiper. We have Pacific tree frogs. And then, to me, a really exciting event was seeing the mallards dabbling. So, if the mallard is there were 2 pairs, they're dabbling, that means there's food there. So, in October, we had a buried wetland, and by February, it's developed enough. We have an exposed pond, and it's developed enough so that there's a food source for the mallards. So the expression, build it and they will come, it's happening. So wetlands look a little rough in the beginning when you do a restoration. These photographs are from our wetlands expert, our National Park Service wetlands expert. These are projects that he worked on, as well as this one. So in 2000, this site at Pecos, they did their restoration, and in 2007, completely filled in. Another site, again, looks pretty rough in the beginning, but 4 years later, it's filled in. So we have high hopes for our restoration here at Prisoners Harbor. And then you have these, you have the goals for the project, restoring the hydrology, restoring the ecosystem function. Then what? How do you document that you've achieved these goals? So these are the basic questions that we're asking, and we have a series of monitoring strategies. We have a ongoing bird survey in the area that we do every spring and fall. We have since 2008. So we know what birds were coming visiting the site before the restoration, and what birds will be visiting afterwards. Hydraulic analysis. We do hydraulic monitoring, vegetation monitoring, amphibian and reptile monitoring. So monitoring process is in play. And then what next? Well, what next is the Riparian Corridor. The goal is to restore the ecosystem function and the hydrologic function of the lower Cañada del Puerto. So in the lower Cañada del Puerto, during the ranching era, it was used for agriculture, and they planted eucalyptus trees. Well, as their priorities shifted and they abandoned their agriculture, the eucalyptus invaded the area. So this was an agricultural field. Those are blue gum eucalyptus, and this was also open field, and those are red gum eucalyptus trees. So eucalyptus trees are known water users, and they're known to dry up creeks in some parts of the world, and in some areas in Australia, they're planted to lower the water table. They also have a rapid growth rate, and they grow to more than twice the height of our native vegetation, the native oaks. So they grow, they use the water, and they overtop the native vegetation, outcompeting it for water, nutrients, and light. They also produce the long shredding bark, which has aromatic oils and are highly flammable. So they're a real fire hazard, especially in Cañada del Puerto, where if there was a fire, it would block the access to the Central Valley and would impede any kind of fire control efforts. Studies have shown in Northern California and the Bay Area that eucalyptus groves are poor quality habitat. Particularly for birds, the birds that you find in a eucalyptus grove are typically generalists that you would find in many other locations. So the goal for this project is to restore the southern coastal oak woodland and the ecologic and hydrologic function of that lower Cañada del Puerto to provide habitat for our rare and listed species. So quick acknowledgement to all the organizations and people that help make this project possible.
I was wondering, you talked about the SHPO. I was wondering if you had to consult with any of the Chumash peoples for the archaeological sites.
We did. We consulted with the San Ynez Band. Yeah. I think.
The willow trees on the island that you planted, the willow stems.
Uh-huh.
Is there a reason that you just cloned them, or instead of doing them from seed? And where did you get those stems?
Oh, okay. So we cut the just a couple weeks before we planted them, we cut them from vegetation, the willows in the surrounding area, just right there, and planted them. So if you plant a willow stake, you have a much greater chance of success, and it's effortless compared to growing something up from seed. So you grow it up from seed, you got to have the pot, you water it, you nurture it, and then you put it in the ground. A willow stake, they just root. Cut them, put them in the ground, and they root. So it's just more efficient. You pick. All right.
You already mentioned all of the monitoring that you have in place that you're going to do, but for what time frame and what sort of plans do you have in place for revegetation or the non-natives coming back and other issues? How long are you going to be monitoring the site for those kind of things, as well as your birds and everything else?
Right. Our monitoring plan is for a minimum of 5 years. So we'll be monitoring the birds, the hydrology, so we'll know when the creek overtops the creek bank, the natural creek bank. We'll know if we reconnected the creek with the floodplain. The invasive species, the weeds, that's ongoing. We've got what we call a search and destroy. So every week, or every other week actually, we're out there checking, pulling the weeds. How long do you have it scheduled for? Well, for 5 years, yeah.
Yes. Are there any other places on the islands where you see this restoration as a possibility, or where you would like to see this change occur?
Wetlands restoration, there's nothing right now. We have some really beautiful but much smaller wetlands, other places on the island that are intact. So we don't have any other
okay.
wetland restoration planned.
What was the budget for this?
The budget for this, including the planning and compliance, preparing the EIS, doing all the site prep, the plant grow out and installation, and the excavation was $800,000. I think there was some. Here you go. There's your microphone there. Sorry.
How many years have you been working on this?
7 years.
And where is the boundary between the Park Service land and the Nature Conservancy land there?
So the boundary runs parallel to the beach, but behind the warehouse. Are you familiar with the site?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
So it's behind the warehouse, kind of up on the hill though, and it pivots where the road to the Central Valley turns. It pivots at that point, and it heads kind of in a southeasterly direction. So the boundary between the Park Service and the NPS is kind of on the east side of Cañada del Puerto in our project area.
Pretty much where the fence lines up as you go up the road there.
Yeah, it's on the other eastern side of the creek.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Has the drought affected the survivability of the plants you've planted?
You know, that's a good question because of that, that temperamental, that tolerance range. And the plants are doing well. They're alive, which is really good because the water has been dropping, but they're this tall. And they're sending out little shoots. So, I walk around and look, little shoots, but they're this tall, and what you'd want them is to be this tall. So, there's a drought. We're not happy about that, but the plants are alive. They're doing well, and what they're doing is they're sending all their energy into their roots. In fact, our wetland expert who helped us do all of this design, he said, if you're really worried, dig down about 2 feet, because that's how far down he thinks the roots are now, after having been planted in December. So they put all their energy into the roots, and since they're kind of stressed because of the lack of water, they're not putting a lot on top. But we have been irrigating the higher ground. We just put a pump in the ponds, and we water the higher ground. And last week, we watered the entire site. So they're doing fine. But we're really happy it's going to rain this weekend.
Did I see a chipper, or what did you do with all those eucalyptus trees that you cut down? With all their oils and everything, are they toxic to leave out there, or what did you do?
We put them through we did a couple of things to them. Put them through a chipper, and that big, huge piece of equipment that was just going back and forth like this in that video, was it called a masticator? And we chewed up the wood, and when we consulted with SHPO, okay, let me step back. We have the archaeological site, and we have a big midden area, which is where our fill disposal area was. And so the SHPO agreed that we could put our fill over the midden area, which actually protects the midden area from erosion and vandalism, but we needed some layer between the native soil, the original soil, and the fill. And so they agreed that we could use the chips from the eucalyptus tree as the demarcation layer. So we chipped up the trees, we put them through the masticator, and we spread them out over the fill disposal area before we put the fill down. That's what we did.
All right. Well, if there's no further questions, do you think one more?
One more.
The skag that is in the photo up there, just on the double fence line, you left that, or it's next to the pond, big pond there.
Oh,
A
yeah, okay.
specific reason for leaving that particular skag?
You know, that was one of those on-the-spot decisions that had to be made, that with our design plan, that particular pond was, you know, supposed to be an oval. And for some reason, we couldn't cut this tree down. It was like, okay, wait to the last minute, cut everything down, just leave the tree until the very last. And the people in the field kept asking me, are we supposed to take down that tree? It's like, just wait until the last. So the excavators came and they started digging and they dug and they said, okay, today's the day. You either cut down the tree or you leave it. And you know, so many birds came to the tree that we decided we're just going to leave it for habitat. And if it falls, fine, it'll be more habitat. But we left it, and it's amazing how many birds use that tree. The peregrine falcon, the osprey, always. The ravens, they've always used it, but they're still using it. But it turned out to be a key habitat feature, which wasn't even part of the design plan. So, yeah.
There was also a beautiful white flower right there where that pond is, yerba.
Oh, yerba mansa.
Yerba
Yes,
mansa.
Yes.
Is there any yerba mansa left in
There
in
is.
that area now?
Yeah, there is yerba mansa, and a lot of it actually kind of tucked back in the willows. So yerba mansa is kind of an interesting plant. It's typically found around cultural sites, archaeological sites. And sure enough, here we have it around our archaeological site. And so although it's not considered native to the island, we decided that we would leave some populations tucked back in the willows because of that association.
And then one more question.
Okay.
I'm sorry. The next phase of the Cañada del Puerto, that area, what's planned and what is that scheduled for?
Our plan is to restore the ecology and the ecological function, the hydrologic function, and we'll do that by removing the eucalyptus trees, preserving the existing oak trees and other native vegetation. We'll do some seed broadcast and some planting, but not a lot of planting. And that work, we're hoping to do that next year, or the end of this year. We've got a narrow window of time for doing that, and we're hoping to do it next year.
Because that's mainly now then going to be on TNC land.
Yes.
And then the kiln that's up there,
Oh, yeah.
anything planned for that?
No, we don't have any specific plans, no plans at this point.
Thank you.
Just one quick question
Sure.
about the eucalyptus. I was just thinking about this. When I went on a hike there, the tour guide told me that some of the eucalyptus are the largest in North America, apparently, and they're some historical value. Are you going to find some way around that, or are you going to leave those particular ones?
There are some historic eucalyptus trees. When you first arrive at Prisoners Harbor, you see a row of trees. Those are historic, and we will leave those trees. And yes, it's true. There is a professor that comes every year to the Central Valley, not down at Cañada del Puerto, comes to the Central Valley and he measures the height of a eucalyptus tree that is the tallest flowering plant in North America.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well, that's a great question to end with. And with that, we'd like to thank you all for attending tonight's lecture. We hope to see you in April for the Kelp Forest Monitoring Lecture.